If God wills it, I am simply a madman. Such fortuitousness has never graced my circumstance, though. Allah saw fit to give me a calm mind and keen eyes, senses I can trust. Although now I know what message He intended these instincts to deliver, I cannot say Alhamdulillah in good faith. I have little praise left to give for Him or any other God. 2001 to 2002, Kandahar, Afghanistan. My eyes were first opened in 2001. I was a fighter in the Taliban, a proud son of Kandahar with his hairless knuckles wrapped around an AK-47, a full 3 years before I was, by your Western standards, of fighting age. I didn't care. In my mind, it was an honor to give my life for my nation, my faith, and the men I blindly believed spoke for my God. I only took part in one operation for them, thankfully. I was there at the destruction of the Buddhas of Bamyan in March of that year. I will spare you the global geopolitics of the event. I knew nothing of them when the statues came down, and I care even less now. What I found in the rubble once the dust settled showed me just how trivial disputes between segments of maps and followers of scriptures actually are. It was a book, a small pocket-sized volume sleeved in leather the exact color and texture of charred flesh. It had been set into a chunk of stone used for one of the Kafir statue's man-sized eyes. I picked it up before any of the gruff men with beards noticed it. I don't know why. I can't pretend I felt a calling. There was no pull of destiny or tug of fate. I'd grown up in Afghanistan under the Taliban. Decades of repression had built an innate adolescent cultural curiosity no amount of devotion to the cause could truly snuff out. I knew instantly any text found in the ruins of a Kafir temple would be haram, and this made it all more exciting. I didn't inspect the small book until I was back at camp by the light of a small paraffin stove long after the gruff men with their convictions and AK-47s had fallen asleep. I was surprised to find it was written in modern Arabic, despite spending over 1,000 years locked in stone. It was the first text I had seen which made no mention of Allah or the Prophet. It was called the Ta'alim al-Jul al-Akir, or the Teachings of the Last Man in English. I read until the most eager rays of dawnlight started poking over the Bamyan Valley's eastern horizon. Over those 6 or 7 hours, my understanding of, well, everything changed. I can't remember exactly how much I read that first night. I know I at least covered the sections on the realms of the dead, how to communicate with them, and what waited for us once we made that journey ourselves. The book was full of anatomical diagrams of unsettling creatures, rites and rituals involving human flesh, testimonies of mortal conversations with beings whose names I couldn't pronounce. There were tales of things that did not exist yet still preyed on humanity, of great scientists from a time before time that created our reality to study, of dormant parasites lost in the earth that could turn men into monstrosities. I don't think I had a concept back then of fiction. I took everything the book told me at face value. I knew I couldn't vocalize this, however. I lost more than one sibling to the pious dedication of my father and uncles. I kept the Ta'alim on my person at all times, versing myself in my new Kafir understanding by flickering paraffin whenever I got the opportunity. Even if I was aware of stories, of words used for something other than worship, I'd have known the texts in the Ta'alim weren't that. Fiction doesn't explain that. No matter how many thousands of pages I read, it never ended. It doesn't explain that my inner voice took on a new, unfamiliar timbre when I studied my secret teacherless teachings. It also doesn't explain that in the years since, so much of what I read in those nights in the desert has proved itself to be true. This was my routine for the next 7 months until that CIA-backed shell bin Laden took my nation out of civil war and into a global one. My father was, how should I put this, quite involved with some of the more revenge-making activities of the toppled regime. That's why just over half a year after discovering the book, I found myself taking it with me as we fled across the eastern border to Pakistan. 2002 to 2003, Peshawar, Pakistan. By 2002, we were bunkered down in Peshawar. I was 17 by then. It was also the time I discovered the other reason I had to walk away from the blind dogma of my father and uncles. I fell in love, deeply in love in a way that was impermissible across most of the Islamic world. When Adil and I stole away and boarded a plane to London from Islamabad airport, he begged me not to bring the TLM. It is to my shame that I showed the first man I loved such dishonesty. Had I remained honest, had I obeyed his simple wish, I might have been sitting with him right now enjoying life instead of, well, this. 2003. A small town, England. Processing and gaining British citizenship took a little while, but as January of 2003 rolled around, Adil and I were settled in a small town north of London. Settled, but not happy. At the time, Adil put my obsession down to escapism, a way to distract myself from the trauma of, growing up as a child soldier for the Taliban. The TLM had all but consumed my focus. Without the threat of gruff men with doctrines and bullets, I was free to study the text at my leisure. To my shame, I dived into the opportunity. While Adil studied nursing and worked every shift at the local supermarket he could find, I lost job after job as my obsession rendered me incapable of leaving the house. He'd beg me to put it down. He wasn't superstitious by any stretch, but he was convinced the TLM was cursed, mainly because for him, the words appeared in Punjabi, not Arabic characters. Given the subject matter regardless of language, I could hardly convince him otherwise. We weren't in that town for long. It turns out there were threats there too. Threats worse than men with AK-47s. Someone must have seen me reading the TLM at the local park or cafe, or maybe in the library on one of the many days I go to find credible evidence that the blasphemous truths I'd learned daily were indeed that. Truths. I was never left wanting, let's put it that way. Every catalog of a manifested entity or cataclysmic collapse of reality coincides with historical event. Everything from the Bronze Age collapse to the burning of the Library of Alexandria was accounted for. I did not think that in the open, permissive, secular United Kingdom there would be a reason to hide my activities. This was what cost Adil his life. The men broke into our flat around midnight. One of them, the one mistakenly outed as being named Dan by one of his peers, kept demanding that I hand over the Chewy Man book. Despite the fact that they were pointing shotguns at us in bed, I swore ignorance. I'd never heard of this Chewy Man, but both Adil and I knew there was only one book that could mean. My love started screaming at me suddenly, mid-interrogation begging me to hand it over. His screams were too sudden, however. One of the men had an itchy trigger finger and Adil's outburst prompted it to squeeze. The blast was loud enough that the man panicked and fled, leaving me screaming alone in my bed with Adil's headless body. I of course called the police. This is why I know that it isn't safe to reveal the name of that particular town. Their tone went from concern to suspicion the second I mentioned our assailant's Chewy Man inquiry. Suddenly, the conversation with the officer went from kind-faced concern to furious inquiry. After our return, once they removed Adil, I found our entire life had been upturned and smashed into pieces. Every drawer appended, every cupboard door ripped open, floorboards pried free in every room. It was when I took a brief glance across the street and caught sight of a police officer watching me from a neighbor's window, shutting the blinds the moment we made eye contact, that I knew I had to leave. This is where my time in Peshawar came in handy. I knew how to lay low when I needed to. A few days after I fled, my face was in the regional papers. I was apparently a person of interest to the local police. I changed my name when my family had left Afghanistan, and when Adil and I fled Peshawar, I was used to acquiring new documentation and identities. 2003 to 2005, London, England. It was in 2005, a few years into my third fresh start, this time in London, that I met Bromfield. He was a mysterious man, thin-faced and stern, employed in the kind of intelligence services only those in Downing Street or the White House knew about. He was also undeniably a genius. How else would he have worked out that I was the man in possession of the book he arrived at the Buddhas of the Bamiyan one day too late to find? It was the report from the town's local paper which tipped him off, apparently. It had taken him several years because, as you can imagine, Adil's family did not want to admit their son was intimately known by somebody else's. Eventually, he got Auntie and Uncle Anad, the UK branch of Adil's family, to crack. I'd met them only once, but their recollection of that brief meeting was enough to land Bromfield on my doorstep. I've met Bromfield several times over the years since. We actually got on well, which is the reason I think he didn't have me quietly disposed of. In one of our meetings, he admitted I'd been, and I quote, a useful source of information for a man who's only 99% omniscient. On our first meeting, Bromfield was interested only in the book. The first thing he said when I opened the door was, I'm here about the book. If you don't want to end up like Adil, let me in. He asked me how much I knew after I let him into my flat. He saw straight through the lie. I told him I didn't really understand the TLM and only kept it as a memento from my youth. For some reason, he didn't press the issue. He left me with 2 warnings, that he would be watching, and so would people and things much worse than he was. I learned quickly that he wasn't bluffing. Part of me thinks he knew what was coming the following evening. In fact, I'd be prepared to put money on it. There was very little that escaped his, as he put it, 99% omniscience. I was again awoken by strangers standing around my bed. These ones weren't men with guns and balaclavas. They weren't women either. I should be so lucky. I think that night was my first brush with one of the things Bromfield had warned me about, one of the dozens of maddening abominations outlined with scientific accuracy in the TLM. They were human in shape, but this is where the similarity stopped. There were 5 of them, each more obese than any person I'd ever seen. Their gray, waxy skin sagged and moved far too little when they spoke, yet far too much when they breathed. The eyes on every paralyzed face were sunken and pointed in different directions, dead-looking and obviously blind. It didn't matter though. When one started speaking, my attention was hooked on its large, perfectly square teeth, angular pearl-white blocks set into concrete-colored gums which moved far more like lips than the actual lips around them. This is the one with the codex? This runt? One had said. Don't underestimate the runts, another replied. As disgusting and pathetic as they are, the parasites have weapons even one as feeble as this can wield. The disgust and obvious loathing in their words made me scream almost as much as their immobile mask-like faces. What they did when my shrieks started only increased the volume. As I sat there on the bed, screeching in blind terror at the things invading my home, each started emanating deep organic squelching sounds. Each of the 5 jaws started to shudder and extend, stretching and heaving until the invaders' mouths were opened far wider than should have been possible. Let's suck the jelly from his eyes, one of them said, their gums flapping and puckering out the words independently of the distended jaw. My screams turned to sobs. As soon as the threat to my eyes was made, each of the 5 opened their mouths wide. Not the mouths of their human flesh suits, those dislocated skin jaws that now flapped uselessly in their bulbous chests. No, they opened the mouths within their mouths, the cement-colored ones that moved those impossibly angular bleached teeth. The air was filled with a strange gurgling noise, audible even over my terrified wailing. My grip around the book hidden under my pillow as it was every night became so tight the cover cut into my palm. From each gaping double maw rose a trip of thick green lashing tendrils. That's when Jimmy showed up. To say Jimmy saved me is the wrong way to phrase it. Redirecting my peril, I think, is a more appropriate phrase. The things in human skin had just about extended their tentacles 4 feet, the tips of the closest brushing my ankles when there was a deafening crash. The door flew from its hinges, crashing into the opposite wall. All 5 of the tendril things screeched, turning towards the silhouette carved out against the dim light of the hallway. No, not here. He has no stake in this, one of them screeched, its wrist-thick green tongues retracting back behind its alabaster teeth. The dead parasite king can't touch the... The figure in the doorway didn't allow the thing to finish. Be gone, you disgusting interlopers. Be gone from this place before the man in charge obliterates you from this and every other star you've tainted. No, the codex is ours. one of the things snarled, re-extending its tendrils. The wraith in the hall reached into the layers of dark burlap and leather patchworked in a cloak over its frame. "I said," he roared, "be gone!" When Jimmy opened his robes, I knew he was no savior. Hundreds of fat red flies poured from the open folds. I screamed louder than ever. So did the gargling skin things. I don't know how I registered it though. Every sound was drowned by the furious buzzing of trillions of scarlet wings. One by one, the skin wearers were filled with the unending swarm until almost in unison, the 5 of them burst in a foul-smelling cloud of gelatinous concrete-colored mush. "What?" I stammered, shaking in my duvet. What? Trespassers from another star. I think that book you have could help them free their disgusting god. Your mate Bromfield trapped it on our planet, you see, a few hundred years ago." I could only continue stammering the word "what" over and over, rocking back and forth on the mattress with the TLM crutched tightly in my chest. "See, the thing is, boy, there's already a god that's claimed these parts, and he don't take too kindly to competition on his turf. The man who I'd soon learn they called Jimmy was eyeing the book with hunger in his milky eyes. He walked purposely through the puddles of alien gore, red flies dancing across his wound-scarred skin. He was thinner than any man should be. The skin of his belly was drawn so taut it was as though his organs had been shrink-wrapped. I could see every inch of intestine pulse, his liver writhing as it worked overtime to flush out the poison seeping from his soul. They weren't wrong, though. The man in charge can't touch it. Neither can I, as it happens. So I guess I'll just have to take you with me. 2005 to 2011. The basement. Jimmy could pack a lot of punch in that wire body of his. By the time I came to, I was somewhere else, somewhere unfamiliar. I wouldn't find out I was still in London until 2011, when Bromfield had finally managed to track me down. He lost a lot of good men in the firefight to get me out, apparently. I could hear the gunshots through the thick basement ceiling. After so many years in near darkness with only the TLM or occasionally one of Jimmy's rabid acolytes for company, I thought I was hallucinating at first. It wasn't until Bromfield slapped me across the face that I realized the thin features that had peered down from the top of the ladder were real. I told him everything on the car journey to the helipad, mainly through floods of tears. At the time, I thought Bromfield had come to save me, you see, an actual savior. As opposed to the mere delaying of a painful death, Jimmy turned out to death. Bromfield had known about Jimmy and his followers for decades. After he told me some other names for this man in charge, various blasphemous combinations of vowels and syllables I refused to replicate here, I understood why it had taken Bromfield 6 long years to make a move. I will not divulge details, but for those long years, some of the most nightmare-fueling rites and rituals contained in the TLM must have taken place mere feet above me. When I realized this, I vomited all over the back seat of the black SUV. Bromfield's thin face in the rear-view mirror didn't so much as blink. He spent most of the helicopter ride over Scotland prepping me with questions about what I'd seen and heard. He found my answers dissatisfying. Eventually, he had to concede that there is little a man can learn from 6 years of holding an ancient book facing outwards while a demented cult leader and his rabid flock copy unspeakable things in beer onto notepads. I spent 6 years turning pages that Jimmy couldn't touch. That was it. Bromfield didn't answer my questions about the alien god he supposedly trapped, or how long ago Jimmy had alleged the incident occurred. It was at this point he paid me the useful source of information compliment. What little I did know on the subject I wasn't supposed to, and apparently Jimmy wasn't either. I didn't have long to probe though, because once we touched down on the North Sea oil rig, Bromfield practically threw me into the arms of some waiting guards. 2011 to 2016. Unknown facility, North Sea. I was taken to an elevator shaft, one that I wouldn't emerge from until 2016 when Bromfield returned to inform me that there had been a change in situation. You've probably guessed, but the rig only masqueraded as one whose purpose was extracting black gold. The underwater facility it shielded from the world stretched for miles in every direction. Despite spending 5 long years below those North Sea waves, I saw little outside of my cell and the mess hall I'd eat in with the other non-hazardous prisoners. There weren't many of us, despite the maps I occasionally saw guards referencing on their PDAs having rooms numbering in the thousands. We weren't allowed to talk either. It only took one shock baton to the back of the head to work that one out. Ironically, I prayed more during this time than any other in my life, even when living under my father's thumb in Kandahar. My connection to Allah kept me sane, even if what transpired once I again found my feet in English shores eroded what faith I regained beneath the waves. Jimmy and his cultists had been harsh, abusive, and violent. The cold indifference of the scientists in Bromfield's facility was far, far worse. For 5 years, the only interaction I had was with a tinny speaker set into one wall of the 7x7 cell. Every day they'd tell me some ungodly word or phrase, and every day I'd open the Ta'alim at random to find the exact chapter they'd need me to recite into the empty room. This was when I realized the book wasn't there for me anymore. I was there for it. It was no longer satisfied with upending the mind and faith of a wide-eyed Afghan youth. It wanted to share its secrets with someone powerful, someone who could put the recipes for potions that turn men into twisted beasts or rituals to open our reality for unspeakable horrors to use. It didn't love me anymore, and the more I realized, the more I hated it. Don't ask me how, but I think the book knew. It began taunting me with the passages the speaker scientists forced me to read. The descriptions became darker, more detailed, more disturbing than they'd ever been over the 15 years I plundered into its depths. I'd spend the hours after the lights automatically shut off crying, staring at the smug black volume on the desk. I begged Bromfield to let me leave it behind when he came for me. By this point, I spent more of my life being captive or fleeing from men with guns than not. I was broken, a shell, a mere vessel for the foul things in that damned book. No matter how much I prayed, Allah could not deliver me from the truth of what I had become. A mouthpiece for blasphemies so impossible they broke the mind when proved. That's why Bromfield moved me out of that facility and why he wouldn't let me leave the book. Someone in his organization had gone rogue, he told me. He wouldn't go into details, but apparently they leaked the video footage of the results of one of the rituals I dictated. He decided that it would be safer to keep me in a location known only to him and to conduct my readings remotely. He slapped me eventually when I wouldn't stop clawing at his coat and begging him to kill me, to free me from the unending pages of horrors. 2016 to 2020, London, England. I was in the cramped flat Bromfield left me in until the first COVID lockdown of 2020. As you can probably imagine, I didn't notice at first. I had no TV or internet access. I was allowed some books, but other than the occasional chit-chat with neighbor Bromfield paid to deliver me basic groceries, I had no information from the outside world. Bromfield last checked in around December of 2019. He looked worried, which was a first. I never heard from him after that. Eventually, around August 2020, TLM reading requests from the tinny speaker above the fireplace stopped too. It was when Hannah informed me in October that the nice man's checks for groceries had stopped coming that I knew something was amiss. Unfortunately, the things planning my capture worked this out before I'd finished planning my escape. I was panicking when the first of the skeletal bird-leg claw hands started pushing up through the floorboards of the ground floor flat. Hannah must have been out because there was no way my screams wouldn't have alerted suspicion. By the time the third and fourth arms had found their way into the living room, there was a warm patch forming at the crotch of my slacks. When the seventh and eighth splintered the wood and pulled up the car-sized baby's head attached to a writhing larval body through the gaping hole, I passed out. Not, however, before hearing the abyssal behemoth maggot thing speak.
"Tongueless Emily sent me to find you, and she said I'm not allowed to take you apart."
I don't know whether it was the quiet whispering of those words or the quiet disappointment in them which pushed me over the edge. All I knew is that my eyes rolled back into my skull, and over the next few hours I'd briefly come to only to slip back into unconsciousness at the sight of those lifeless, face-sized baby eyes and spidery claws carrying me through the dark. Thank you, Thytherathax. The man in charge will extend your freedom for another age as promised. Jimmy was standing above me when I came around. I was in another ground floor flat, larger but more dilapidated than the one the thing disappearing down a large hole in the floor had abducted me from. I screamed when I became fully aware of my surroundings. However, it wasn't because of the gleeful-looking face of Jimmy with its dancing runic scars that moved more as you looked at them. It was because of the woman sat in the chair. Well, I say woman. I assume it was female. It had breasts, but it also had a tail and 6 eyes and a needle-teeth-lined mouth that ran right around the back of its neck, somehow surrounding its entire face. The top half of its head was suspended in a trio of thick, muscular stalks set around its whirlpool throat. There was a thick purple tongue lolling out of that hole, one that had been severed just beyond where it hung over the bottom row of teeth. The pet abomination she stroked on her lap was perhaps more terrifying still. A snake-like thing that looked uncannily like a human spine with skin loosely draped over it. There was a head at either end of its body, a human head, one young, one old. Both faces purred as her gnarled hands stroked the vertebrae, the thousands of index fingers arranged like centipede legs on its underside shivering with each brush. "Don't mind her," Jimmy rasped, pushing the book across the floor to me with a long stick. "She's not really here. She's somewhere else with the man in charge. She's just making sure you come back home now that pesky Bromfield is preoccupied with other matters." I was too broken to respond. The lines between the book and reality had fully broken. My soul was heavy with the weight of decades spent living in peril, misery, and the sanity-breaking verses of the Te'alim Arajua Alakir. Tears fell silently down my face as I picked it up, the last of the will in my faith finally broken. That's when the bomb went off. The wall behind the clawed woman launched itself into the room. Jimmy was knocked sideways by a flying brick. The woman creature in the chair vanished, the debris and shrapnel passing harmlessly through her before she dematerialized. I can still feel the gaze of her 6 eyes boring through me in those final moments before she was gone. The thing in her lap, however, wasn't so lucky. A propelled shard of wood caught the temple of its rear head. It scuttled off on its finger legs into the dust cloud, the remaining head howling in agony. It had been several years since I'd been in an explosion. My ears rang, my vision blurry and swimming. There was a man standing above me, an expressionless man in a trench coat not unlike those worn by private investigators in trashy 50s movies. He scooped me up and carried me out into the street, glancing furtively over his shoulder as the police cars began to roar around the opposite end of the street towards the burning building. "We don't have long," he said once we were several streets away and my vision had returned. "I'm not going to bother telling you my name. I've just got one question. Do you want to get rid of that book?" I looked up at him, my face covered in tears, throat too raw to talk, and nodded furiously. His blank expression didn't change, but he nodded back. "Good. There are powerful things out there, even more so than the self-proclaimed man in charge. They locked that book in the statue for a reason. They've asked me to make sure it's returned to where people like your friend back there can't find it again." He walked for another hour when finally he stopped outside the red wooden door. "Here's the place." He knocked 3 times, then waited. Eventually, a squeaking elderly female voice answered from the other side of the wood.
"Yes, dearie?"
"I'm here to see the librarian. The ones in the stillness would like to make a deposit."
"Ah, right. Well, hold on a sec then, love."
There was a series of metallic clunks and scrapes from behind the door. When it swung open, the dark hallway on the other side was empty. Well, empty of people at least. What it wasn't empty of was books. Warped wooden shelves surrounded us for the hour or so we wandered in that library. Each was stacked to bursting with unsettling titles and covers made of ever more suspect materials. The lighting and shadows were all off. But I'll be honest, by this point I was too disoriented by my lifelong ordeal to find this too perturbing. I wish the same could have been said for the librarian. The man in the trench coat had warned me, putting a finger to his lips as we finally turned a corner after walking in a straight line for miles upon miles of book-filled shelves. If he hadn't, I wouldn't have had the self-control to place my hands across my mouth and stifle my scream. The giant ear turned towards us as soon as we turned the corner. I could feel its irritation, its malice growing with each whimper I couldn't retain. The man squeezed my shoulder, repeating his earlier gesture before speaking in an almost inaudible whisper.
We are sorry to disturb your silence, librarian. I've come at the behest of the ones in the stillness. I bring you a rare text for your collection. My instructors beg your forgiveness for the intrusion, but as they are sure your all-knowingness is aware, this particular volume has been causing quite a bit of disruption. It's been giving certain minor players ideas above their station.
The slight tremble in the expressionless man's blank monotone did little to calm my nerves. The ear turned to face me. It was attached not to a head, but to a neck. A human-sized neck, I'll bet a long one. The lanky body this neck was in turned attached to stoop slowly from its desk. It began walking towards me, its 1920s-style gray suit and polished black dress shoes making no sound as it glided across the wide lobby in 3 silent steps. The earhead was inches from my face. It drilled into me, somehow gazing deep into my terrified eyes, despite having none of its own. I could feel the man who brought me here holding his breath as it dawned on me then just how stupid it had been of me to blindly follow him here into the den of something far worse than anything encountered due to the TLM's twisted machinations. Speaking of, I could feel the small black leather book trembling in my pocket. I didn't want to be here. It was terrified of the ear-faced figure towering above me. So terrified, it could no longer conceal its sentence.
Please,
I heard it murmur in my head.
Please don't leave me with him. I can change. I promise. I'll show you wonders. Unlock eternal euphoria. I'll...
Obeying it was out of the question. The librarian whose outstretched palm I placed it in, my bottom lip quivering and my pants full of piss, carved out a void in my mental state the size of which the TLM could never hope to match. 2020. Present. Hell. I could still feel the librarian's gaze long after the man in the trench coat shut the red door behind us. I felt it still when I awoke in the hospital when I was covered in blood and informed by a frantic nurse I'd been in a gas explosion that a stranger in a trench coat had dropped me off at A&E. I felt it most when they wheeled me down to physiotherapy during the weeks I spent in recovery. Amongst the black and white photographs of old shops, schools, and churches that lined the corridors, there was one of an old library. I had to pretend I couldn't see the shadowy ear peering out from a top window. I had to ignore the way it turned to face me as the chatty, oblivious nurses wheeled me from A to B. To be honest, it didn't matter much to me. The book was gone. For the first time in 20 years, I wasn't waking to find the Te'alim Araju al-Akir clenched tightly to my chest, far away from the pillow I'd placed it under before sleeping. I'm currently living in a hospital on my 4th, and hopefully final, identity. That's where I'm writing this from, and why I'm writing it to you. I can't adjust to the world without the book. As much as I hate myself for needing it, I can't deny that I do. However, I also can't bring myself to go back to it. I loathe it with every fiber of my being. My only other option is... Well, let's just say that after I'm finished here, I'm going down to the Thames and I'll find out if anyone was listening to my prayers all these years. I'm making my account public because I've noticed how strange the world I'm leaving behind is becoming. Bromfield is gone, and as much as I both fear and despise him, I have an unshakable feeling he and his organization were one of few things preventing our reality from unraveling. I have seen stories emerge. I have seen more and more references to things I read in that damn book cropping up online every single day. I don't want to be here when those prophecies come true. Please, whoever is reading this, keep your eyes open. Whatever you think you know, you don't. Our whole reality is one chip in a game too complex for any of us to fathom. And as much as I love to console you with thoughts of being too insignificant to catch the player's attention, their all-pervasive gazes make this harrowingly far from the truth.